I was told that the ride on the Rathayatra bus was Prabhupada's long-cherished dream. And because the vehicle that we had just repaired was in such first-class shape, we were informed that our bus would be used to take Srila Prabhupada, and that I would be the driver, and Mahamuni would be the servant, and Sunanda would be the cook. Now, Prabhu, I was an expert bus driver, expert. I could pull that bus into any spot, eyes closed. Somehow or other, when Prabhupada and all these sannyasis and senior devotees got on the bus, I was like terrified. I was like really hyperly nervous, you know. So we go out of the Lincoln Tunnel. Now, you know, it's a huge curb. And the curb itself, it has a really high cement curb. And somehow or other, the wheel itself, it gets stuck on the curb. I can't turn it to get it off. So the curb is guiding the whole bus. And sparks are flying out. Nobody, no one knows but me, right? And I'm just praying. I said, Krishna, why are you doing this to me now? I'm going to kill my gurus, sannyasis, the deities who are going to go tumble. I said, kill me anytime, any way you want. Please don't. Prove I have never, ever, ever experienced fear, anxiety, suffering like that. So I was just praying, trying to hold the bus so that the wheel would veer off to the left. And just finally, after about 2 minutes of that, just intense, you know, 2 minutes was like an eternity, a few eternities. So finally the bus pulls away. Definitely some of my life force was dropped on that curb coming out of Lincoln Tunnel.
Srila Prabhupada had been standing looking at the wonderful fields. The devotees were gathered around. There were two fellows who were new devotees, very enthusiastic. They were country boys from not too far away. And they had brought from their own garden a medium-sized basket full of vegetables. And Srila Prabhupada picked up an eggplant out of the basket, and he just held it in his hand as though it were a jewel of some sort. And he held it kind of up and just looked at it. It had a real value, this produce. You can just tell his pleasure was immense. So at some point he spoke about how we should be able to feed the neighboring city temples, supply them with very luscious kinds of fresh foods like this. But not only that, but in time of need, we should be prepared to also produce an abundance sufficient to feed people living in a 10-mile radius.
Prabhupada took a walking tour of the barn and the machine area, and Paramananda was a little bit apologetic because Prabhupada had been to New Talavan a few months ago and chastised them for having farm equipment. But actually they had farm equipment and was standing outside in the weather getting rusty. And at Gita Nagari we had a lot of farm equipment, but everything was very well protected. But Paramananda was very much self-conscious. So as he was showing Prabhupada the different equipment, he was saying, and this is a disc and it'll do the work of so many men, and this is a plow and it'll do the work of so many men. And Prabhupada was very silent. But when Prabhupada gave his class later on that evening, he said, it's not that we hate machinery, everything can be used in Krishna's service. He also very much caught our mood that we didn't want to be in the cities. And so when Prabhupada noted that, he commented in his class, it's not that we hate the towns and villages, everything belongs to Krishna. So he saw our mentality, and he cut through it very effectively.
When we picked up Prabhupada in the airport in New York, I was in the car following Tamal, Adikeshava, Rameshwar. Were in the car with Prabhupada. And they wanted to show Prabhupada where the temple was in relationship to all the other prestigious buildings in New York. So we went up Park Avenue, around Grand Central Station, and the Seagram's building where my father worked. And my father had been one of the guarantors for the temple. He'd spoken up as like a character reference for us to get this building. So as they drove by the Seagram's building, which itself was an architectural landmark, the first all-glass skyscraper in New York, they pointed out, oh, Prabhupada, look, that's Dristadumna Swami's father's building, the biggest liquor company in the world. And Prabhupada, liquor? Hiranyakashipu. But his son is like Prahlad.
My husband, Chaitanya Sima, he had been working on the building of the LA temple, and then it was finished. And then one day Srila Prabhupada called him up to his quarters, and he said, "We've purchased a 13-story building in New York." And he was explaining to my husband that it was an old nursing home, and it was just a very old, broken down building, and the whole bottom floor needed to be gutted and made into a temple room, and all the floors had to be repainted and scraped and sanded, and it was just a tremendous amount of work. And he was asking my husband how long that would take. So my husband was just working it all out, and he was about to open his mouth to say, possibly we could do it within a year. But just before he got that out, Srila Prabhupada looked at him and smiled, and he said, "I'm due to be in New York in 6 weeks." And the next thing I knew, my husband came home and said, "Pack, we're moving to New York in the morning." And we did. And we started work immediately. And honestly, in the 6 weeks, I don't remember sleeping. I guess we must have. It was a 24-hour marathon for 6 weeks. And we did it. I don't know how it manifested, only by Prabhupada's mercy. But then there's a sweet little end to this, is when Srila Prabhupada was arriving, we were lining the walk from the front door to the car, and everybody was standing there with beautiful gifts and so many things to offer to Srila Prabhupada. And then I saw my husband come rushing out from doing the last minute things, and I could see him looking. Everybody had something to give Srila Prabhupada, and he felt he had nothing. So he rushed back in, and he went into the Pujari area, the flower room, but every last flower had been used, and all he could find was one rose, kind of dead and blackened. So he just grabbed it and ran back out, and he was holding that. And then Srila Prabhupada came out of his car, and he just kind of floated along, swan-like, and everyone was giving him gifts, and his arms would pile up, and then he'd hand them back to his servant. And then my husband was watching all these gifts, and finally he just put this old rotten rose behind his back. And Srila Prabhupada was just looking straight ahead the whole time. And then he came to my husband, and he just stopped, and he held his hand out. And my husband didn't do anything for a minute, and Prabhupada moved his hand, like, "Give it to me." And so he brought this old wilted rose out from behind his back and put it in Srila Prabhupada's hand. And Prabhupada held the rose between his two hands in a pranam and turned to my husband and said, "Thank you very much." He is just such an amazing soul. The most wonderful thing about Srila Prabhupada is he just knew everything. He just knew your heart.
Regarding the Rathayatra, Srila Prabhupada actually asked, "How is it possible you got the permit?" Because he was aware that it was very difficult to get a permit on Fifth Avenue. As a matter of fact, it was technically against the law because there was an edict by the mayor that said no new parades since 1962. So he asked, "How did you do it?" Anyways, and so I thought I would tell him something since he's asking. It was ultimately his mercy, his pastime. So I simply said, "Well, Srila Prabhupada, on the application, I said 3 hand-pulled carts." And so Srila Prabhupada laughed and he said, "Yes, this is in our line. Just like Vamanadev, he only asked for 3 steps of land." Of course, what's always amazing about Srila Prabhupada's quips is they're so full of spiritual realization and knowledge, and they're so spontaneous and so quick. Yes, that is in our line. So wonderful.
New York Rathayatra was really a momentous event. It was a great triumph, the one I filmed. I'm from New York City, and I went to high school near the Plaza Hotel, where Rathayatra to this day still begins there. And so the Upper East Side was where I grew up. And I knew the significance of the Rathayatra Festival going down Fifth Avenue. I really understood what that meant. And I reflected on how much it meant to Srila Prabhupada, because he started in New York City. And New York City, I knew, meant a lot to Prabhupada because it's the most important city in the world. And I think Prabhupada knew if he could establish himself in New York, then that was a good thing. And for me, having the Rathayatra Festival go down Fifth Avenue with Srila Prabhupada in the chariots was one of the most triumphant moments in the history of ISKCON, because New York is the Big Apple, and in a way the whole world watches everything that was going on there. And sure enough, the next day in the New York Times, on the front page, was a picture of the Rathayatra chariot going down Fifth Avenue. And I was so proud because I knew Srila Prabhupada would see that. It described the Rathayatra procession with Prabhupada in very sober and positive terms.
Parading down Fifth Avenue with Lord Jagannath was the fulfillment of really a lifelong ambition. I was sitting with Prabhupada once in Mayapur, and he just turned to me and he said, when I was a young boy, I wanted to perform the Rathayatra. And so my father got me a Rathayatra cart. And Prabhupada was looking at me like he was about a 6 or 8 year old boy. And he said, everybody thought it was just a play, Rathayatra. Then he touched me like this with his hand. He said, but it was real. It was real. He said, I used to go to sleep in my bed with the Rath cart next to me. In the night I would wake up and reach out to make sure that it was there. He said, in this way from my childhood I was performing Rathayatra in a small way. And now I'm doing it in a big way all over the world. His ambition as a young boy is to take the train from Calcutta to Puri, that he could go to the Rathayatra in Jagannath Puri. What an ambition for a child. Such a pure ambition on his part that Lord Jagannath fulfilled it in such a grand style.
1976, after Mayapur, Tamal Krishnaraj and I went to New York to get help from my father to be able to get into China, because China was closed. Madame Mao was in power and her gang of 4, and it was terribly xenophobic. No Westerners were allowed in except under special circumstances. So through my father's contacts, we were able to get IDs as like spiritual sky incense representatives going to look for incense punk. So in New York, we got Brooks Brothers suits. We started to grow our hair. The party was now under Madhavisa. It was the GBC of Radha Damodar, New York, and Gita Nagari. They'd merged into one huge party. And Adi Keshava was the president there in New York. So we had a room there, we did our thing, and we got prepared. And we were en route to Hong Kong via Hawaii, where Prabhupada was writing his 8th canto, the story of Gajendra. And at that time, 2 things happened simultaneously. One, he didn't approve of us going to China anymore because he considered it a waste of time under those conditions. There wouldn't be any possibility for preaching. And secondly, that Madhavisa disappeared, given up his sannyas. So Prabhupada said, so you go back and take up your party, which was the last thing we ever expected to hear from Prabhupada, given the intensity of the emotions just 2 months earlier in Mayapur. So that was a big shock. Prabhupada said, so now you go back and take up your party, but one thing you must learn, you cannot force. So there were some discussions then about sannyas. Prabhupada said, actually, I have not given any of you sannyas, but I am in a war with Maya, material energy, and I need leaders. He said, it is called in wartime battlefield commission. There are no qualified leaders, but someone has to lead the charge. So you take, every 5th man, you're now lieutenant of the squad. He's really a private, but we make him lieutenant for the day. And he leads the charge. And then Prabhupada said, it is to be understood that you are not sufficiently equipped for this fight. And most of you will go down. And I know what he means now that I'm older. We knew very little, but we were enthusiastic. So we show back up in New York, having never gone to China, and Prabhupada's coming. So Tamal and Adikeshava asked, would I manage the Rathayatra overall? So I did. And it was wonderful working with Jayananda. I'll never forget that.
The parade had already traveled about a mile from Central Park, and it was headed toward Washington Square Park at the end of Fifth Avenue. Srila Prabhupada stepped up onto the Subhadra cart at 34th Street, and the police who were overseeing the parade took note, and they told me later, said that man was really special. And they ended up volunteering, the same group, every year for that duty, because they actually took some thrill in the occasion. It was a voluntary task. Obviously, there was some compensation, but they took interest and they looked forward to participating themselves in the Rathayatra.
Rathayatra parade was going down Fifth Avenue, and we drove down parallel, maybe down Sixth Avenue, and we crossed a couple of blocks, and we saw, like on one cross street, one of the Rath carts, and then when we got down to the next cross street, there was the other one. So it stretched the whole city block, and it looked really impressive from where we were. And then we cut across to the cross street where the Empire State Building is. Then we waited there for a few minutes for the Rath cart. We were a little bit ahead, and then the Rath carts came down, and then they stopped just where we were, and then Prabhupada got out. But I remember there was this tremendous scrummage. There was all reporters, newspapers and TV and what have you, and they're all, literally, there were one or two of them were fighting with each other to get in because everybody was so packed up, and the devotees were all around chanting and dancing like crazy when Prabhupada came out. Prabhupada just kind of glided through the whole thing. So you see Prabhupada bumped his head on the decking, it was so low. So they were a little paranoid that, some crazy people might try to do something. So it was a security measure. We also sat with him under the decking, and there was about 3 or 4 devotees that were sat on the corners and next to the Vyasasan. And I found out later that they were all armed. They all had guns on them. I think the deprogramming stuff had just started up in America, and there'd been demonstrations in LA in early June, so they were a little bit afraid of that. So from our vantage point, we really didn't see very much. We were underneath the decking there. All we could see was lots and lots of people up and down the streets. Prabhupada really enjoyed it because it was exactly 10 years to the month, when he had formed ISKCON in New York in that little tiny storefront with just a small group, 5 or 10 hippies. And now he's back in New York, gliding down Fifth Avenue with these massive Rath carts, hundreds and thousands of people watching. Prabhupada said it was like a dream come true.
I had lived with Jayananda for 2 years in San Francisco, so we were very close. He was in preparation like normal, doing everything himself, superhuman effort to prepare the carts for the festival. So I came up the elevator in that skyscraper building, and I came around the corner, and there was a bathroom down that hallway, and I saw Jayananda, and he was walking with his torso parallel to the ground, literally. And I yelled out, "Jayananda!" And then I went running down the corridor, and before he got to his room, I came in front of him and I said, "Jayananda, what's going on with your body, with your health? What is it?" And he looked at me, put his hands on both my shoulders, and he said, "All right, I'll tell you something, but you've got to promise me one thing, that you won't say anything until after the Rathayatra." And I said, "Okay, Jayananda, I won't say anything, please." And then he lifted up his arm, and underneath his armpit there were huge lumps. And then he lifted up his other arm, and his other arm was the same, these huge lumps. And I said, "Jayananda, you have to take care of it." And he said, "You promised." So I kept my mouth shut. based on that promise. Of course, it turns out he had leukemia. Means that Jayananda was suffering like anything during the preparation of that Rathayatra. And then that famous picture of him pulling the cart in complete ecstasy. You look at his face, you could not have told that he was racked with pain. That's who Jayananda was. Fixed in service to Srila Prabhupada.
I had taken sannyas in 1975, so I was still relatively new sannyasi, and of course I was a young man, I was only 25 years old. And Prabhupada had his quarters on the 11th floor, and I was sitting with Prabhupada, and he said to me, "Prabhupada, have you seen the New York women?" I was a young sannyasi, and I didn't know what to answer. Have I seen the New York women? So I hesitated to answer, and he just went on. He said, "They're so beautiful, so charming." And he began to talk about the New York women. And then as he continued, he said, "In this way, they're controlling all of the men in New York City. And because they're controlling all of the men, all of these buildings are going up. And the whole city is manifesting." And he went on like this, describing the whole development of New York. And he said, "It is all Vishnu Maya." And it was so edifying for me, because often the take on sannyas in ISKCON was anti-women, and women were to be avoided, and something like that. But to see Prabhupada, the perfect sannyasi, meditating even on the beauty and the charm of the women, and then be able to take it to that point that he did in perfect Krishna consciousness. It's all Vishnu Maya. He could meditate completely on the material nature, material energy, and because of seeing it in relation to Krishna, he would never be in danger of being affected by the material nature. This is the real idea of sannyas. So it was very enlivening to me to hear him say that. He wasn't really trying to teach me the point. He was just being himself, just expressing himself. And of course, whenever he expressed himself, however poetically and beautifully through his motions and through his words, it was very profound and edifying.
At any given day in New York, the streets of New York and that Washington Square Park were always filled. So the additional event of Rathayatra captured the attention even of New Yorkers who are well known for having seen everything and done everything. This was a first for them, to see literally hundreds of saffron and white-robed devotees bouncing up and down joyously in kirtan, and at the helm of it all was Srila Prabhupada. The stage was right under the arch there. Prabhupada ascended to that stage, and there was an ocean of people, devotees from all over the United States, as well as so many bystanders.
We were all sitting on the stage facing Prabhupada, and everybody else was on the ground facing Prabhupada, and Prabhupada was the only one that was looking out. So he left after about 20 minutes. He gave a short speech about where the Rathayatra had originated from. And then we left and went back to the temple, and he left the devotees to run the rest of the festival. So when we got back to the temple, Prabhupada was a little fatigued. So he went to take rest straight away, and Prabhupada asked me to massage his legs and feet. So as I started massaging him, he started chuckling. And then he said, "I thought there'd be some fanaticism." And I said, "What was that, Srila Prabhupada?" Because I remembered there were some Christians out there with their turn or burn banners and all the rest of it. And then Prabhupada said, "Did you see?" He said there was one man, he was shouting. He was standing on the edge of a fountain, and he was heckling. And he said then one big black man came up and he knocked him into the fountain. And Prabhupada laughed like anything.
Trey Rishi told me that I had to offer my obeisances to Srila Prabhupada when I walked into the room, and there was no way I was about to do that at that point in my Krishna consciousness. I was too green. I wasn't about to offer my obeisances to anybody. But I was respectful, so I walked in and I folded my hands and bowed my head slightly and didn't say anything. And then I didn't know where to go, so I just kind of went towards the back of the room. Srila Prabhupada was way across the room at a desk. And Srila Prabhupada looked at me and he said, "So, you are interested in Krishna consciousness?" And I remember I didn't understand a word he said. I'd never met anybody from India before and never heard them speak, so I didn't understand the accent. And Prabhupada recognized my embarrassment and said to my husband, "So, you'll translate?" And my husband looked at me and said, "So, you're interested in Krishna consciousness?" Then we talked for a little while. I asked a few questions. And then a young woman came into the room with a big bowl of sweets. They were white balls, looked like very large golf balls. I didn't know they were sweets at the time. And then he looked up at me and he motioned with his finger for me to come forward. So I got up and I went to his desk. And he said, "Hold out your hand." So I held out my left hand. And he said, No, other hand." So I held out my right hand, and he took one of these balls and he put it in the palm of my hand. And I remember it was juicy. I remember the juice was kind of dripping from my hand. I was trying to hold it so that it didn't drip on the floor. And I looked at the ball, and I looked at Prabhupada, and I looked back at the ball, and I wasn't sure what I was supposed to do with it. And Prabhupada motioned with his hand in his wide open mouth, as if to say, "Pop it in your mouth." That's exactly what I did. This huge ball, I got it into my mouth in one fell swoop. And when I bit down into it, the juice was just so sweet, and the squeak on my teeth really got me, and my eyes bulged, and it was just such a delightful thing that Prabhupada got such a kick out of it. He laughed and laughed. And we talked for a few more minutes, and then someone came in and said, "Srila Prabhupada, it's time for you to go to the airport." And the sannyasis left first, and then my husband left, and I kept thinking, what am I going to say to Srila Prabhupada to make him understand how grateful I am for the time that he spent with me and the loving exchange we'd had? And I kept thinking, what can I say? What can I say? And I was almost out the door, and I remember the last minute I turned around, I folded my hands, I looked Prabhupada straight in the eye, and I said, "Hare Krishna." And that was the first time I'd ever said Hare Krishna. And Prabhupada said, without a moment's hesitation, he said, "Jai." And then I left, and I was in ecstasy. That was the beginning of my spiritual life from that point forward.
After college, I went to India for about a year. Then I came back to England. I was very interested in the Indian philosophy. So I read many, many books, and I sent away one time for Prabhupada's Gita. I got it by mail order. So I read that in a few days, and I was thrilled by the book because it was so clear and sensible and correct. There wasn't anything that I could find fault with. And I thought, this book is, perfect. So then I hitchhiked down to the address within it, which was the manor. So I arrived at the manor, and that was the weekend that Prabhupada was there. Actually, when I walked in the manor, Prabhupada was just giving a darshan. So Rohini Nandan invited me to the darshan. It was a darshan particularly for new people. So I sat down, and as chance would have it, I was sitting immediately in front of Prabhupada. So Prabhupada was sitting there perfectly relaxed. And I felt very thrilled to see Prabhupada. I felt an immediate rapport. Prabhupada was sitting there, and every now and again he'd glance at me, and smile at me. So I felt enlivened. And I had this feeling that Prabhupada was looking at me and he was saying, "Where have you been?" So anyway, the next day or so, Prabhupada went off to Soho Street, and he came back to a great reception. The car, it was a black Rolls Royce, pulled round to the back of the manor. As he drove by, I looked in the window and I saw Prabhupada's expression. It was just startlingly full of love. And Prabhupada got out of the car, and a huge uproarious kirtan was going on. The devotees were leaping in the air and chanting. So Prabhupada glanced over at me, and then he pointed with his chin to this about 11, 10-year-old boy that was dancing next to me with his arms upraised. And as he pointed with his chin, he smiled at me and immediately understood, this is what you do. Prabhupada had seen that I was confused, and so I immediately understood this is what Krishna consciousness is, simply to dance and chant, like a child, without any mental reservations.
This is our residence, Bhagavad Bhavan. It's a very ordinary, semi-detached property, and by that stage we had been initiated for 6-7 years. This is Mukunda, and what we're anticipating is the arrival of Sri Gurudev, Srila Prabhupada. These are our family friends and have been invited. These are people who visit Bury Place. This is Dr. Bajpayee, a very well-known medical doctor in a number of medical fields. He is on the right-hand side, along with my father on the left, and we're simply discussing how we individually met Srila Prabhupada. Dr. Bajpayee, who was a first life member of ISKCON London, had many conversations with Srila Prabhupada, and Srila Prabhupada would often discuss philosophy and medicine.
One of the things Srila Prabhupada did in the early days, which the devotees didn't really do too much of, and that was to make contact with his fellow nationals. Obviously, in London, there was a very large, prominent Hindu community who had never heard of the Hare Krishna movement at that time. I think Srila Prabhupada's physical presence, him being in Indian as well, opened up a lot of doors to the Indian Hindu community who might not have otherwise accepted the Hare Krishna movement, simply because they would have been skeptical in thinking, oh, what are these Americans or Europeans practicing this for? But when they met Srila Prabhupada, their minds were changed completely. So if you had a devotee like Kshirodakshaya Vishnu and his wife and his sons, they didn't live in the temple, but they lived in North London in a house which had deities in it, and it showed that you could practice Krishna consciousness outside of the temple environment, and you could do it anywhere, in fact.
This is the temple room. This is an example of what Prabhupada blessed us with since the initiation. He installed our deities some time back. For us, it was a wonderful homecoming, and I think Srila Prabhupada felt that as well. The dialogues would not be formal. Sometimes they would be just as friends or as father and grandfather would have. And whenever we would reciprocate with Srila Prabhupada, whether it was through glances or through singing or through listening, he would just reciprocate and laugh and joke tenfold. Srila Prabhupada would tell us many stories from different parts of Srimad Bhagavatam, and he would intermix accounts of these stories and his own life. And I distinctly recall feeling stories of kindness from Srimad Bhagavatam, gentleness of devotees and clemency. We were always making mistakes, but Srila Prabhupada would have that quality to be forgiving. Though he was communicating Krishna consciousness, it was never in an academic way, or it was never dry or impersonal. It was just full of life.
This is Srila Prabhupada sitting down on the Vyasasan. He spoke a little while, and then he felt that he would like to take a little rest and bath in our place. So my father arranged all the bathing arrangements, and he took massage, and then he took prasadam. It was at that time where Srila Prabhupada asked the whole family to come into his room, and Srila Prabhupada gave my father the instruction that I want you to establish Deva Varnashram Dharma by practical example. And what he said at this time was that first I came to Kshirodakshaya Vishnu's house as a friend, then I came to Kshirodakshaya's house as a spiritual master, and now I'm coming to his house with Radha and Krishna. Srila Prabhupada had conquered the whole world, but he was still happy to come to an ordinary house like this and bless us with his blessings. It was amazing how Srila Prabhupada hadn't changed one iota in spite of all the opulence and the great wealth that he had acquired, but still he was always fixed in his love for his disciples.
There was talk of the Kumbh Mela, and Srila Prabhupada said it was the most auspicious Kumbh Mela in 144 years. And all the rishis and sages and sadhus would come from all over to attend this particular Kumbh Mela. So it became real imperative that we all figure out how to get there. But there was no trains, planes, no way to get in, no way. Everything had been booked for months in advance. So Abhiram knew the manager of the entire train station in Bombay. His name was Mr. Gupta. And so he came in and he saw Srila Prabhupada, and he put on 2 extra cars for the devotees, 1 second-class car and 1 first-class car. And so the devotees were able to go in. And as we were on our way, we were in the coupe right next to Srila Prabhupada and Rameshwar Maharaj, and we were trying so hard to hear. And you could hear their voices, but not what they were saying. But it was so comforting to know Srila Prabhupada was right there.
On the way to the festival, and I think it must have been 1 or 2 in the morning, and I suddenly woke up, my eyes just completely snapped open. So I looked around, expecting to see Srila Prabhupada sleeping, but in fact he was up, sitting there, and clearly waiting for me to wake up. He somehow made me wake up. And so he gave me the opportunity to talk with him, and we spoke for hours. And every question I could think of about the world and of world events and events to come, I was asking. We talked about the Cold War and nuclear arms. And we talked about many different things. Prabhupada would explain, all from the point of view of absolute knowledge, why the world is always a violent place and why there's always war and misery and pain. So that was helpful for me to just understand that whatever time in the history that you live, these characteristics will always be there.
Early 77 in Vancouver, we were going out on Sankirtan, and I was with Kripanidhi Das, and we loaded up a van full of books, and I told Kripanidhi for some reason that day I was going to go alone. And by the end of the day, it was 640 Srimad Bhagavatams and Chaitanya Charitamritas. And then later on in the year, I was in Berkeley, and Radha Ballabha had approached me. He was on the train with Prabhupada going to Kumbh Mela at the time. And he said that Prabhupada was very ill. He was lying down, and they showed him the newsletter of all the devotees in the temples around the world that would distribute books. And the biggest distributor would get his name underneath your temple. And Radha Ballabha said that Prabhupada sat up and he pointed to my name and he said, "This is what gives me life when I see my disciples distributing my books like this." And he pointed to my name, Tota Gopinath. Every time I go to tell a story, even now, it's it makes me cry, I get tears in my eyes. It's that's the one thing that's kept me a devotee. It's, for that 1 second, special moment when Prabhupada points to your name like that and recognizes you.
When we arrived there, we were taken out to the campsite, and Srila Prabhupada was distressed by the location because it was sort of an out-of-the-way place. And so he called for the managers to come, and he really questioned why we were in this location, because he wanted to be centrally located in the middle of the action. But then at the end of their conversation, he said, "Never mind," and he just said, "I will send you to the action." And he would just send Harinam Sankirtan and book distribution parties out to the people during the day. And he wanted to make sure that there was adequate prasadam. The first day there was not proper amount of prasadam to distribute to other people. There was just enough for the devotees there. And Srila Prabhupada really stressed that that wasn't the appropriate arrangement.
During the festival, I don't think we really did the things that Prabhupada was planning to do in terms of having kirtans, the big stage, and so on. Because Prabhupada was, his body was becoming ill. It was manifesting symptoms of that illness that lasted for those last 6 or 7 months. And so it didn't appear that he was comfortable. It appeared that there was pain and he was just not being bothered by it because of his transcendence. So there were a lot of mixed emotions at this festival because of that. But there was a constant, non-stop parade of all kinds of people, dignitaries, spiritualists who were there and heard that Prabhupada was there and would find their way to where our tents were and just come to get Prabhupada's blessing. That was the whole purpose of this festival, is to purify yourself in these rivers, and you get the darshan of the holy men. So the people who knew, they would try to find Prabhupada.
The devotees came from Los Angeles with a new Balaram Mridanga, and they were colorful and lightweight. And everyone was excited about it. This will be the new drum for ISKCON. So they put it on Prabhupada's darshan desk one evening, and everyone was holding their breath. What will be the judgment? And then he very deftly and expertly hits the mridanga, plays 1 or 2 bowls and tals, dot, 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 and then sits back. And he said very matter-of-factly, "It's dead." All the excitement over that mridanga, Prabhupada dissipated it with 2 words, "It's dead." And we can understand how that it's not so easy to please a spiritual master. Things have to be done correctly and properly, because the whole relationship between the disciple and the guru is one where the guru wants to bring perfection out of our hearts. Like the lady in the village is churning the milk to bring the butter out of the milk. But if she stops halfway and says, "I've done my job, that's enough," then the butter will not appear. So I saw that he was churning everyone in the room, and especially churning the producers of the mridanga. More surrender. Your perfection is not there yet. You have to do more churning to get this final product of the perfect mridanga, or the perfect offering, or the perfectly pure heart.
While Srila Prabhupada was in Mayapur after the Gaur Purnima festival, we arranged for what turned out to be Srila Prabhupada's last public preaching program, the Pandal program at Cross Maidan. As had been done in Delhi, we arranged prominent people to come as chief guests, but the biggest, of course, was the Chief Minister of Maharashtra, Sri S.B. Chavan. He had great appreciation for Srila Prabhupada, and he actually helped the devotees get permission to build the temple at Juhu. So Srila Prabhupada was very pleased when he came and spoke. And Srila Prabhupada also addressed him very nicely in his talk and told him that as long as we're in the material world, as long as we're in politics, there will be upheavals. But we should tolerate the upheavals and continue with our duties in Krishna consciousness.
Prabhupada's health had deteriorated considerably. He had no muscular strength at that time. In Mayapur earlier, he extended his arm and sort of flapped where his arm muscles were with his hand and said, "Flat tire." So Prabhupada's health had really gone down. He was practically deposited on this asana and just was there. One night the verse was, "Hogs, dogs, camels, and asses glorify a person who has no interest in hearing about the personality of Godhead." So the disciple was reading, and Prabhupada hardly said anything. The reading is going on. But as it was going on, Prabhupada was getting more enlivened. So he would go from giving one sentence to giving 2 sentences and 4 sentences. And soon Prabhupada was speaking with full enthusiasm. He had so much energy. By the end of the lecture, practically Prabhupada was roaring.
The theme that Prabhupada had chosen was that the material civilization, modern civilization, is total failure. Only solution is Krishna consciousness. And he was speaking on this theme every night. Bhavananda, I think a lot of times some others would read a text from Bhagavatam, purport, then Prabhupada would comment. And the memory I have is how strongly he was preaching, like a roaring, scaring his fellow citizens, trying to wake them up, shake them up. I don't remember any other time Prabhupada was as strongly, forcefully, emphatically making his points, reminding them, Bharata bhumite manusya janma hoila jar janma sarthaka kari kara bharo pakar. You are born in India. If you want to make your life perfect, don't need the life of cats and dogs. Do paropkar, take to Krishna consciousness.
I was there when this play was shown here. I remember the Vaikuntha players. I remember how powerful the actor and actress. Only thing that surprised me to see Sita as an American lady. And I didn't mind Ravan being American, but I was still in the bodily concept. But the important thing was these actors and actresses were so wonderful in their acting. They really brought out the best of Ramayana. At the end, Prabhupada said that these are better than the book. Then he said something else that evening. He said, when Lord Chaitanya himself performed his plays 500 plus years ago, Sachimata, his own mother, could not recognize her own son. Lord Chaitanya, I believe, acted as Lakshmi Devi. That's the power of a strong actor who really puts his consciousness, heart and soul in the role he plays. And that's when the Lord himself assists such an actor to exhibit all the qualities of that person. So I observed that, and Prabhupada was extremely happy with these Vaikuntha players. That was obvious at the end of the play.
I didn't get chastised, I didn't get reprimanded for anything. He was always very kind to me. And I think that's what helped me love him more and do things more. In the time that he got sick and he came to Bombay, and they wouldn't let you go into his quarters. You know, I was not used to that. I was used to walk in anytime. And I remember Tamal Krishna, he came in and he looked at me and I said, they won't let me go in and see Prabhupada. And then he goes, he's taking rest. I said, but I want to see him. I said, he's been here for so many days, I haven't been able to see him. So then he goes, you be very quiet, just go in and come out. And I remember going in there, and Prabhupada was sleeping, and I just like stood there for a few moments. I remember just sitting there and looking at him. And he was just laying there, and you didn't see him feeling the pain. He was telling us he was very sick and his stomach hurt, and you didn't see that. You saw him very calm and peaceful. And I just like grabbed his feet and I ran. And I don't know if I woke him up or not, but I remember like I just grabbed his feet and I ran out. And that was the last time I saw Prabhupada.
Govindam Adi Purusham Tamaham Bhajami.
When we arrived in Rishikesh, one of the first things Prabhupada wanted was to drink some water. So somebody gave him some water from the tap, and Prabhupada said, did I come to Rishikesh to drink tap water? And so I just ran down to the river and got some water from the Ganges, and Prabhupada was very pleased to drink that straight from the river. And those days I was a brahmachari. I just got initiated a couple of months ago. And Prabhupada was very restful there. And we were just a handful of devotees. And one day I was cooking and Prabhupada decided to teach us how to cook. He first asked me to cut the vegetables, and then he showed also how to cook basmati rice. And the rice was just mixed with ghee. And Prabhupada told me not to even wash the rice. And then put it on the fire. And when the rice was cooked, every single grain was separate. And Prabhupada showed how to make the chapatis. And one day was Ekadasi, and we somehow, we are not careful and we broke the Ekadasi. We took some grain for breakfast, and then we realized that it was Ekadasi. So I went and told Prabhupada. Prabhupada's immediate reaction was, so what can be done? You broke it, you took the grain. But then he got very annoyed. He said, there was the point in having a Pandit with us if you can't even tell us when is the Ekadasi. And Prabhupada said, then observe the Ekadasi the next day. Although he didn't break the fast, but Prabhupada that day also took grains with us. Like that shows his compassion for his disciples.
In Rishikesh, Prabhupada was lecturing there, every evening giving a class. Famous Maharishi Mahesh Yogi was also in Rishikesh at the time, and many of his teachers were coming to attend Prabhupada's lectures. So at that point, Maharishi sent a note to Prabhupada saying that, Swamiji, I've heard that you are quite ill. Perhaps you should not exert yourself so much. Better not to lecture in the evenings. Because he felt worried that so many of his teachers were listening to Prabhupada. One European lady was there, a very sweet lady, and she asked Prabhupada, it's very nice what you're preaching, but what are you doing for the suffering of the people of the world? And you would think that Prabhupada would be very sensitive to her being an elderly European lady. Well, Prabhupada, he just exploded. He said, what do you know about mercy? What do you understand about compassion? It is simply sentiment. He said that your idea of giving, some sort of relief to people's suffering is like blowing air on a boiler. It's full of pus. The kind act you can do for such a person is to cut it. So mercy means to cut through the ignorance that persons are under. And our preaching is based on this understanding, that ignorance causes suffering, and that to enlighten people is the way to free them from ignorance.
So everything was very wonderful in Rishikesh, and Prabhupada was very restful, and we were having a wonderful time. And then all of a sudden one day there was this huge storm, and it looked so ominous. And it was not only heavy rain, but there was a storm. And the storm made some electric poles topple over at some place, and electric supply got disrupted. And it became very cold also, cold, rainy, and wind. And it was very kind of eerie, like ominous. And those days I used to attend Srila Prabhupada from 12 to 2. And it was around 1 o'clock, Prabhupada just called me. And he told me that the time has come for me to die. And I want to die in Vrindavan. So make arrangements to take me to Vrindavan. And it was such a shock, as if it was a bolt from the blue. So that night only we packed everything up. And we decided to leave the next morning.
Radha Krishna Padaravinda Bhajananandina Matvalikam Vande Rupa Sanatana Raghujugam Sri Jiva Gopalakam Vande Rupa Sanatana Raghujugam Srideva Gopalakam.
When Prabhupada arrived, the devotees were so happy. And when Prabhupada went to his room, all the devotees came in, and there Prabhupada broke the news why he came. And I remember in a flash of a moment, their ecstasy was transformed into agony. Devotees started to cry. And understanding their feelings, Srila Prabhupada then started to console the devotees by explaining about the futility of our material existence. He quoted the verse, Dehi nosmin jatha dehi. It's just a matter of transmigrating from one body to another. And Prabhupada called me when all the devotees left. And he told me, from now on, don't cook for me. Don't force me to eat anything. So what's the use of eating when there is no appetite? And I felt that Prabhupada is actually stopping to eat and drink like Parikshit Maharaj, preparing to leave his body.
Our Gurukula wasn't finished at that time, and we had rooms in the guest house on the third floor, top floor. And I would go onto the roof of the guest house, and you could overlook onto the roof of Srila Prabhupada's house. And in the evening they would set up a mosquito net for him and a lamp on his desk, and you could hear Prabhupada push the button click of his dictaphone and then translate. And he would do that night after night, but who knows how late Srila Prabhupada would stay up translating, even in his poor health. So it was very assuring to hear Srila Prabhupada in the still of Vrindavan in the night, where you would hear a bell from some ashram ringing the time out, or you'd hear a peacock call. But in the stillness of the night, you would hear Srila Prabhupada translating his Bhagavatam for us and for the world.
I went to Vrindavan and I was given the service of being Prabhupada's secretary, and I got this room that overlooked Prabhupada's roof. I had a bird's eye view from my little office. It was great. And I remember looking out one time, there was a huge wind blowing, they call it the loo, you know, that bad wind. It's really unhealthy and everybody goes indoors and buttons up the shutters. And Prabhupada just stayed outside translating, and he kept trying the mic and putting it down and waiting for the wind to go down a bit, but he just had his chud around him and he didn't go in, he just kept on translating.
The most traumatic thing I remember of that period is when Srila Prabhupada left for London. He left at midnight. So all the devotees stayed up to say, well, goodbye to Prabhupada, because he was going off to the West to preach. And as the car pulled off, it suddenly stopped. And it stopped in such a position that I was looking down at Srila Prabhupada, and Prabhupada was looking up at me. And he was on at least one guest house mattress had been placed in the back of the ambassador car, and he was lying on it. And I'll never forget looking down at Prabhupada and Prabhupada looking at me, because obviously his body was flesh and bones, but there he was going off to London to preach. And I was so shocked, because he didn't look like he should be going anywhere, but still his determination to preach and to please his devotees was far bigger than his desire to look after his own body. And that picture of Prabhupada has stayed in my mind all these years. Prabhupada's determination.
I remember standing in the alleyway there, watching Prabhupada drive away, and when Prabhupada's lights were no longer seen, I was reflecting about how Srila Prabhupada's life's energy was simply utilized for the purpose of helping others, benefiting others. It was not ever selfishly used, but it was selflessly used. And this was Srila Prabhupada's glory.
Srila Prabhupada was very happy to be here at this point in London because India had become most unpleasant. Just prior to leaving, the riot had occurred in Mayapur where Bhavananda had been arrested and other devotees had been arrested, and Srila Prabhupada understood that they were actually looking for him, that they wanted to arrest him. And he was feeling very disgusted with India. He said, "What have I done?" He said, "All they've done is harass me." He came into London, he said, "Here everyone is so nice." He said, "Everyone has always been so helpful to me." So we came into the manor, into his rooms, and I remember sitting with him that day or the next day in the drawing room, and he was just appreciating how nice things were in the West. He said, "Everything in your Western countries is so nicely done." He said, "People are also so nice. Simply if they wouldn't eat the cow." He said, "Isn't there any other kind of meat they can eat besides the cow?"
I was traveling. I intended to come to Europe to do street clowning with my girlfriend. In New York City, we met a Sankirtan devotee who gave us a book and a record, Radha Krishna album. And when we heard this music, I remember thinking that there's nothing I want to do besides find out what this means and meet the people who are singing this music. So we went to England. That was in March of 77. So it was only 4 months later that the devotee said, "Srila Prabhupada is coming." And we all considered it just a wonderful miracle that somehow or other we were actually going to be able to meet him. Many of the older devotees were pained to see him in that condition, but to me it was the first time I saw him, and he just was so incredibly attractive. He was glowing like the sun, just so beautiful, like the ripened fruit of tapasya. I'd never experienced anyone who was exuding so much love. I just was astonished. I had an interesting experience that while he was giving this first lecture, I was sitting, back in a corner where I could see him, but so many devotees around. But I had the strange feeling that while Prabhupada was speaking, he was looking directly at me and speaking to me. It was as if he had sat down in front of me and said, "My dear child, this is why you've been suffering in the material world, and now it's time for you to go back home, back to Krishna. Come with me and I'll take you home." I felt pretty silly due to my big false ego, thinking that I had received special attention. So after the lecture, when I went out into the hallway, I overheard some devotees speaking that, I had this strange experience that Prabhupada was looking straight at me and speaking directly to me. And then I heard another group of people speaking, and at least 3 or 4 different groups of devotees mentioned like this. I was just kind of stunned. What kind of person is this? And it was also interesting, while I was in this lecture, I had a unique feeling that Prabhupada was looking straight into my soul, that he was looking at my essential self, not at the person who I had previously thought I was, but looking through all the layers of my conditioning to see my true self, that I was an eternal, spiritual, living entity, a servant of Krishna, and that he would hold this realization of me so strongly. It felt as if that could bring me out of all those layers of conditioning to the point where I can also realize who I am. So
because I was a latecomer, and in one way felt unfortunate that I was only able to see Prabhupada in his very last days. In another way, I felt like I received a wonderful benediction.
He would sit on the chair in front of the deities, and the kirtan went on for a long time. And I remember Bhagavan, he was leading, but they were singing that tune, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna. And so Prabhupada was just sitting there watching. And he was completely happy, it seemed, just listening to the kirtan. To me, that was indicative of, how important the kirtan is. That Prabhupada, even though he was trying to write so many books and do so many things, but he still just sat down for an hour. He would just listen to the kirtan and nod his head. But he was completely happy. Everybody was dancing and he was swaying his head, and he looked very immersed in some kind of deep reverie.
And then he would be carried out, and he would go up to the top landing, and they would turn him around and he would smile at everyone. And then he would go on up to his rooms. Everyone would bring news. When they would go in, they would come back out and tell you what was happening. But it was so different from any other time that Prabhupada had come, in that you knew he was on a different platform. He stopped pretending to be on the Madhyamadikari platform because he would just glorify anyone who went inside. He would glorify everything that they'd done. You were such a great help in Srila Bhaktisiddhanta's movement, and it was pretty incredible. That time was just so different.
The atmosphere was, as it always was whenever Prabhupada was present, incredibly intense, but now it had a special intensity because it was more than clear that Prabhupada was making his last appearance for us in the West. And what struck me was his having darshan of Radha Gokulananda. No words spoken, but simply his presence before the deities. One had a clear sense that he is now simply reciprocating with the deities, and they are saying, yes, it's that time. And then after 1 or 2 days, the news came that Prabhupada was going to Buri Place. And Prabhupada came into the temple and came before the deities, and this time he took off his sunglasses. He had been keeping them on all the time, but this time in front of Radha Landaneshwara, he took them off. One could see the tears streaming down his face. It was pretty amazing.
There were a lot of events taking place that for us were very emotionally churning and disturbing. There were moments when we would feel that Prabhupada was going to recover, when he would start to take something and indicate that he would stay with us, and we would feel the greatest elation and the greatest joy. We felt like we had been dunked under water in a dunking chair, and suddenly we were being brought up for a breath of air. And then just as extreme and suddenly, we would see a symptom that he was not perhaps recovering his health, and it was continuing to deteriorate. And then we would be plunged into the greatest, in the abyss of lamentation and great fear and anxiety that he might leave us. So it was emotionally extremely difficult time. And I was present at the time when Krishnadas Babaji came to visit Srila Prabhupada and sat on his bed at his feet and massaged Srila Prabhupada's feet and held his hand. And Srila Prabhupada asked him for forgiveness, saying, "Please forgive me for offenses that I committed to my god brothers, the Vaishnavas." He said, "What could I do? I had to preach strongly. And Krishnadas Babaji, of course, rubbed his hand, rubbed his arm, and said, "There's no offense, Swamiji. There's no offense from you." I think he said, "Please be at peace." And Prabhupada actually cried for that forgiveness.
So I went to Vrindavan and I had a letter from Jayapataka Maharaj explaining about the idea of going to Nepal to go and start a center. So Prabhupada got the letter and then he called me. He was sitting on the veranda upstairs and he looked very ill. I'd never seen him looking so ill. And then he welcomed me and he thanked me for preaching in Bangladesh. And then he told a story about one Bengali poet, Michael Madhusudan Datta. He had gone to London and he squandered all his money. So then he was asking everyone to please help him, and no one would give him any money except this one gentleman called Vidyasagar. So he gave him some money, and so this poet glorified that man, and he said, "You've got the courage of an Englishman and the heart of a Bengali mother." So then Prabhupada said that you're an Englishman, a Britisher, and you have to show that courage. The British were famous for expanding an empire. He said they expanded their empire all over the world. Even America is your creation. So similarly, you should expand the empire of Krishna consciousness and do it with the courage of an Englishman and the heart of a Bengali mother.
Srila Prabhupada would have darshan of the deities, and it was not uncommon. He had these sunglasses, as you can see in the video. Tears would stream down his eyes, roll down his cheek, just with his hands folded, slight nod. Each deity and given some charnamrita. And then taken into the courtyard under the shade of the tamal tree, and Satchidananda, a brahmachari, sang many of the nice bhajans in the courtyard. Srila Prabhupada would sometimes ask for him by name. He had such a sweet, melodious voice. And the boys would get up, 2 or 3, 4 of them at a time, and they would dance in front of Srila Prabhupada, and Prabhupada would nod his head. It was so nice.
One afternoon, many of our older godbrothers were in the room with Srila Prabhupada, and many of those who were supposed to initiate disciples after his disappearance were there. And then Prabhupada said to them, "Of my disciples, I see no one who has my qualities. If I see a group of them together, some percentage of my qualities are certainly there." He says, "So I have some faith that this movement can go on. The test of your love for me will be shown by how well you cooperate together."
I'd sometimes cut through and be on the side of the path as Prabhupada brought around. He had on the dark glasses, but you could see his eyes were fixed right on you for long periods of time, like, coming the whole length of the temple. You can just see that you're being scrutinized. And then all of a sudden they opened the barrier. Anybody could go into Prabhupada's house and join the kirtan. Prabhupada wanted all the devotees to come in. So the last 2 months, practically every day I was in there. And there are a lot of mystical experiences that took place. What happened was, I had never really led a kirtan. I'd always joined in the background. And so Sadadanya was taking care of Prabhupada, and then he walked out of the room. And Jayadvaita's there. And then he handed me the little cartels. And so I started playing my first kirtan. There I am in front of Srila Prabhupada. And so not even 60 seconds go by, and all of a sudden the whole place transformed. The whole place just opened up in the spiritual world. So many devotees had similar experiences. So for me, it was like a verification of what Prabhupada was saying always, that through him you get the connection to the spiritual world. And that happened. Just like that, all of a sudden, boom, everything opened up. Krishna is there. And how can I know that it was just the power, the potency of that moment, and the visual thing that just transformed the whole room. And so Krishna's on the line. "What do you want?" I just broke into tears. "What can you want more?"
it was enough for me, and so I didn't ask for anything. But by the mercy of the spiritual master, we're thrown right into the spiritual world, whether we know it or not.
Shortly before Srila Prabhupada left, we were in Hyderabad farm, and we heard that Srila Prabhupada was very ill in Vrindavan and might be leaving us very soon, and we wanted so badly to go, but we couldn't leave the temple alone. There was nobody else there. And then when Brahmachari came and kindly agreed to stay just for a very few days and let us go to Vrindavan, we had very little money, but somehow we booked on the most basic tickets all the way from South India up to Mathura. It took a long time, and we had to sit on our suitcases with the chickens and the goats. It was a big austerity to get there. And then when we got to Mathura, we only had enough time to go and take one darshan of Srila Prabhupada and get back to Mathura for the train back down south again, which was a 2 or 3 day ride. So we took a Tonga and we rushed to Vrindavan temple, and we knocked on the door of Srila Prabhupada's quarters, and we were told Srila Prabhupada's not seeing anybody, only a few sannyasis. There's no way, and we tried to explain, but we've come all the way from Hyderabad and it's our last chance to see Srila Prabhupada. No, it was Bhavananda Prabhu was telling us, no, I'm really sorry. He was, very kind about it, but it's just not happening. And so then we were so sad. So we came out, and then we were standing on that path outside the rose garden, and then there's French windows, French doors, and then there was the bed where Srila Prabhupada was lying. So we were standing on that path and just saying our last prayers to Srila Prabhupada and knowing that he was just on the other side of those doors and curtains, but we couldn't see him. And suddenly the curtains opened and the doors opened, and there was nobody else around on the path. There was only us. And we said our last goodbyes to Srila Prabhupada. We paid our obeisances, and we saw Srila Prabhupada lying there so ill, and we could take a last darshan. And Prabhupada gave us quite a darshan, and then the curtains closed and the windows closed. And then Bhavananda came out and he said, those curtains and doors haven't been opened in months. And suddenly Srila Prabhupada said, open the curtains, open the doors. So again, Srila Prabhupada just knew, he knew that we were there. He knew that we'd gone through quite some austerity to take a last darshan. He knew it was in our hearts. We just wanted to see him one last time. And he granted that.
At some point, Yadabara asked if we could film him while he translated. And finally we got permission. We set up some lights so that they were not too bright. The bright lights bothered Prabhupada's eyes. And we filmed him as he translated from the 10th canto, chapter 13, text 53 of Srimad Bhagavatam. And our microphone was right next to his mouth, and I had the headphones on, so I heard him speaking. And he said right into my ears, everything is acting, moving by the supreme desire of Krishna. This consciousness is Krishna consciousness. So although I heard that from him directly, I could in no way relate it to that situation. That Prabhupada was about to leave this planet, was speaking one of his last purports, that this was the supreme desire of Krishna was beyond my comprehension. What we wanted at that point was Prabhupada's vibrant preaching, his good health, traveling around the world, guiding us and correcting us, enthusing us, showing us what it's like to be a Krishna-conscious devotee. And to think that now it was Krishna's desire that he leave was unacceptable. And also in that purport, reading it today, there's no way of guessing the dire circumstances that Prabhupada spoke it in. Right there in that one purport, it was Prabhupada's determination and his 100% dedication to the mission of his spiritual master. Completely resolute in his purpose.
Varnashram dharma is so essential that people remain in subtle Tamagun, Rajagun, Rajastama Bhava increases lust and greediness, and that implicates the living entity to exist in this material world in many, many forms. That is very dangerous. Therefore, they should be brought into Satguru, that is establishment of Varnashram. How to bring people in Satguru with Brahminical qualification, very neat and clean, rise early in the morning, this Mangalarati in this way, to stay in Satguru. Then one cannot be influenced by Tamagun and Rajagun. That is the special feature of human life.
He spoke about ISKCON as a child, as a baby, that needs nourishment, that needs protection. And he expressed to me true concern that after his departure, he was concerned for the baby. And he emphasized, kind of begging, that unite together, stay together, so that this ISKCON, this baby, can be protected. And there was a clear link that he wasn't talking about the buildings, he wasn't talking about the forms. There was a clear link between the content of our relationship, the love we felt for each other, the willingness we had to sacrifice our own egos in order to reach understanding, in order to reach collaborative mood with one another, rather than organizational asset and all of that, in order to hold and protect and grow the baby. That was very, very clear to me, and it was very, very clear from every word coming out of his mouth.
I had always had this desire to touch the lotus feet of the pure devotee. And this was back to the time when I was getting Brahmin initiated in 1974. And I asked Srila Prabhupada, could I touch his feet? And Prabhupada said, that is not necessary. So in Srila Prabhupada's room, I look over and I see Trivikram Swami, and he's massaging Prabhupada's feet. And I'm thinking, why is he getting all this mercy? But then I'm thinking, oh, I don't even deserve to be in this room. And then all of a sudden, Maharaj yawned. And I went, oh, Krishna. So I humbly came over to Maharaj and said, would it be okay if I took over and massaged Srila Prabhupada's feet? And he said, okay. I thought, oh my God, I don't believe this is really going to happen. So then Maharaj took me over and he showed me. So I was so gentle and I was massaging the lotus feet of Srila Prabhupada, and I got to massage them for 2.5 hours. And then at one point, Prabhupada looked up and said, who is massaging my feet? And Tamal Krishna Maharaj said, oh, that's Udayananda Das. And Prabhupada said, oh, And then there was like this smile on Prabhupada's face, as if after all these years, he was fulfilling my desire. And then, by the mercy of Srila Prabhupada, he allowed me to massage his feet every day for the next 3 weeks. But I was thinking I was the most fortunate soul in the whole universe at that time.
I remember sitting next to Srila Prabhupada one night. We used to sit up and attend to him. And there's a special time in the middle of the night, I suppose it's 1 or 2 in the morning, when in Vrindavan the peacocks go off in sequence and start calling, responding to each other. And it's a chain reaction throughout all of Vrindavan. Anyone who's lived in Vrindavan knows this moment in the night. It's a magical moment. So Srila Prabhupada was resting at that time. I was sitting silently chanting on my beads. And when the peacocks went off, Srila Prabhupada, he had his hands folded as if in prayer across his chest. And he started to roll his head and moan. He rolled his head from side to side, and he moaned 3 or 4 times. He started a new moan in obvious response to the peacocks calling. And it was a deeply ecstatic moan, a moan when somebody is enjoying something in an extreme sense, but on a level that is just impossible to imitate or describe to you. And the room at that time, for me, the space that we were experiencing at that moment became multidimensional, to the point where the paintings on the wall actually became 3-dimensional, especially the painting over Srila Prabhupada of Krishna and Balaram. And I realized at that moment that Srila Prabhupada was already in that space, and we were viewing him from a very limited awareness.
The last time I heard Srila Prabhupada speaking was the night before his disappearance. I think it was around early evening. And we were listening to Prabhupada speak to Swarup Damodar about life comes from life and not through a combination of chemicals. And then Srila Prabhupada said, the scientists, they cannot understand that life is coming from life. And then he said, they cannot understand Bhagavad Gita. They cannot understand this verse. Brahma Bhuta Prasanatma Naksosati. They cannot understand the Brahma Bhuta personality, that he's experiencing happiness from within. And that even though his body is completely destroyed, he stressed it, destroyed, he is in ecstasy. And then he said, I am that Brahma Bhuta personality. And that's the last thing Prabhupada said.
In 1977, when I was on the plane en route to Vrindavan to Sri Srila Prabhupada, I vividly remember reading the first canto of the Bhagavatam, Nasta Preshu Abhadreshu Nicham Bhagavata Sevaya, which describes how by regularly hearing the Bhagavatam or rendering service unto the pure devotee, everything inauspicious within the heart is destroyed practically to nil. And in that purport, Prabhupada describes how the person Bhagavat and the book Bhagavat are actually identical, because the person Bhagavat lives his life in terms of the book Bhagavat. And when I got to Vrindavan, I remember walking in Prabhupada's room, offering my dandavats, and then getting up and looking at Srila Prabhupada, and it's very difficult to explain in words what I saw, but I could see that Srila Prabhupada was the complete embodiment of his books, and Srila Prabhupada was fully embodied in his books. It was like Krishna just gave me some kind of vision that was beyond anything I'd experienced before.
One night, in the middle of the night, when I was sleeping on the roof of the Gurukul building, one of Prabhupada's assistants came and woke me up. And immediately so many thoughts rushed through my mind. You know, is Prabhupada leaving? Is something wrong? What's happening? He said, Prabhupada is calling you. So I rushed into Srila Prabhupada's room, and then, every word of Srila Prabhupada's was so full of meaning, because one never knew, one thought it might be Prabhupada's last words or last instructions. So Srila Prabhupada asked me, "Do you think the movement will go on after I go?" And I said, "Yes, as long as we're sincere and chant our rounds and follow the regulative principles, it will go on." And then Srila Prabhupada, with great difficulty, because he was so sick and so weak, pronounced the word intelligence and organization. And I realized that yes, we do have to chant our 16 rounds and follow the regulative principles and be sincere in our devotional service. But to preach Krishna consciousness, we have to be intelligent and organized. And Srila Prabhupada wanted to balance what I had said with the powerful instruction, intelligence and organization. Then Srila Prabhupada asked, "Is there anything else?" And within my heart, I wanted to cry out, "Srila Prabhupada, stay, please stay, don't leave." But somehow I couldn't say it. And I just said, "No, nothing else." And later I regretted that I didn't say what was in my heart.
Every day was emotional upheaval. We would hear different reports from the Kaviraj. We would hear what Prabhupada drank, what little bit he might have eaten. The overwhelming mood was one of despair, that clearly Prabhupada was preparing to leave this world. And certainly we had no idea what would become of us and what would become of his mission in his absence. Very often his godbrothers would come to visit him to say farewell, and Prabhupada would exhibit extreme humility and apologize for saying things that perhaps offended his godbrothers. And he would ask for their forgiveness, saying that in the course of preaching, perhaps he was sometimes too strong. And his godbrothers invariably would say, "No, there is no offense taken, that Srila Prabhupada has gloriously served their spiritual master," and they took him as their leader. Other times disciples would come from throughout the world, and Prabhupada would have words of encouragement for them. He would inquire about their activities. And he was also concerned for all of us in Vrindavan. He would ask if the prasad was satisfactory, if there was adequate prasad. So in this way, he exhibited his incredible concern and his awareness of what was going on, even in that condition.
While I was massaging him, I was astonished to see some of his activities. Sometimes he's crying, sometimes he's stunned. I remember his hairs standing on end. He was belching. And I was shocked to see all of this. And then I started to remember in Nectar of Devotion that each one of these was an ecstatic symptom of a greatly advanced devotee who is in the highest stages of spiritual consciousness.
We stayed in that room whole afternoon, and now the reality was starting to hit. But even though the Ayurvedic doctor had said what he said, still within our hearts there was a ray of hope that Prabhupada can again start reviving himself. This was our prayer and this was our hope, but at the same time there was a kind of acceptance now that was taking place for us. And especially as the afternoon wore on and Prabhupada was not showing any signs at all of reviving to external consciousness. So now the time was drawing closer and closer. And as it drew closer and closer, the kirtan got more and more intense.
the kirtan was being sung in a kind of unusual chorus of two parts in a way that we never sang before. Some of the people in the room were singing Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada, while other of the devotees were just chanting Mahamantra, and somehow it just blended together in the most perfectly beautiful way. As I was listening to it, I was thinking, we don't sound like this. This isn't coming from us. It was like there was no ceiling on the room, that all the concrete or bricks or iron beams or whatever that was there had just dissolved, and the whole room was open like a direct current to the spiritual world as Krishna's messengers came for Srila Prabhupada.
It's not that you could hear anything, but I was like really close to Prabhupada's face, and I was looking at him, and I just noticed that his lips moved. And when his lips moved, it appeared as though Prabhupada was pronouncing Hare Krishna. And at that moment, his jaw dropped. And at that very second, when he said Hare Krishna and his lips opened, I saw the color of Prabhupada's body change. And when I saw that happen, I thought, now my spiritual master has left his body. And everyone else in the room, they knew that that was the moment also. They started weeping like they'd lost their life because Prabhupada was our life. I was watching Pishima, and she was weeping. She just bowed down to Prabhupada's feet, and she started taking the dust from Prabhupada's feet, and she started smearing the dust on her head and smearing the dust on her eyes. Then I decided that I should do as Pishima had done, so then I went and I took the dust from Prabhupada's feet and I rubbed on my head and my eyes. Then there was a request that the devotees would step outside so that they could prepare Prabhupada. And the majority of the devotees left. I stayed behind. And Upendra, very masterfully, he just sort of took control of the situation, and he brought fresh clothes, and he very, very quickly dressed Prabhupada. And I remember he took a cloth and he tied it around Prabhupada's head so that Prabhupada's mouth would remain closed. And they put Prabhupada on his palanquin. And then we were waiting for the Gaudiya Math devotees to come over and give some instruction on what to do. They came and they offered a garland to Prabhupada. Tamal Krishna Maharaj and Bhavananda Maharaj, they consulted with the Gaudiya Math devotees. And then it was decided to take Prabhupada for last darshan of the deities, and then make parikrama of the temple, and then place Prabhupada on his Vyasasana for the Guru Puja. So I remember when they carried Prabhupada into the temple room, one of our god brothers, his name was Puri Das, he was the pujari for Gornitai. And either it was at the beginning of the arti or at the end of the arti, I'm not really sure. The last arti, it was the Shayan arti. Puri was on the altar with the conch shell in his hand. I remember Puri turned and he saw Prabhupada on the palanquin, and Puri fainted right on the spot in front of Gornitai. And they put the palanquin right up on Prabhupada's Vyasasana. The palanquin just fit up there quite perfectly. Bhavananda, who had been caring for Prabhupada through Prabhupada's final pastimes and had been with him and, had been giving such a strong face and such a strong appearance. I remember when they put Prabhupada on the Vyasasana, Bhavananda went behind the Vyasasana and he just collapsed and he started sobbing like a child. And the Gaudiya Math devotees, they were leading kirtan. And when they sing Jaya Nila Premadana, I remember I personally collapsed, and the devotees, practically they couldn't sing because everyone was crying so much. And there was a succession of bhajans and kirtans, and everyone offered garlands and flower petals to Prabhupada. I remember people from the city, they were coming and they were offering. And then through the course of the night, the kirtans went on. And because I knew that I had to cook the next day, I sort of tuned out about midnight, and I went and took rest for a couple hours. And I was told that in the middle of the night, they didn't know who to ask to lead bhajan. And I was told they turned to this little man that had been there the whole time, and I'd say the majority of the devotees, they didn't know who he was, and it was Srila Kinchana Krishnadas Babaji Maharaj. And I was told that they asked him, "Prabhu, could you sing?" And he picked up the mridanga and he started singing, and because his singing was so pure and it was so full of love for his friend Prabhupada and for Radha and Krishna, everyone collapsed again. And then we went for the Mangal Artik, and the Mangal Artik at Krishna Balaram Mandir that morning was led by Anand Prabhu, Prabhupada's godbrother. And then after the Mangal Artik, then they took Prabhupada for his last parikrama.
At first light after Mangalarti, the devotees took Prabhupada in a palanquin. And I remember Narayan Maharaj was leading the kirtan, Nadi was playing drum, and I had kartals. We went all the way down to Vrindavan, and then of course then I noticed all these hundreds of people that came from nowhere. I couldn't figure that everyone had heard, or if they had heard that Prabhupada left. I never saw Vrindavan in such a mood that everyone came out to pay homage. It was so early in the morning. The rooftops were packed wherever we went. And then we took Prabhupada to all the Goswami temples of Vrindavan, Madan Mohan, Radha Damodar, Radha Shyamsundar. And we ended up at Govindaji, and from Govindaji we came back from there.
There's two things that Srila Prabhupada gave me. One was personal association, and the other was some attachment for Vrindavan for whatever reason. And Upendra got in touch with me when Prabhupada was in Vrindavan and was starting to become very sick, and it became very clear he was going to leave soon. And I actually went to Vrindavan and spent time with him there. That was the first time I ever went to India. And courtesy of Tamal Krishna, I got to spend a lot of time with Srila Prabhupada personally. And I was able to do little things to help. And that was a remarkable time. There was one moment in particular which stands out and has always remained with me, that normally Srila Prabhupada would give instruction in a very straightforward way by speaking to you. But by now he was very, very sick, and he actually had to be picked up and rolled over in bed and carried. You know, he was getting ready to leave. And I'll never forget this. We're on the roof of his apartment in Vrindavan, and my job was to burn. We had a pot of, I'm not quite sure what it was, but I was burning it to keep the mosquitoes away. And there was peacocks cawing in the background, and the smells of Vrindavan, and the feeling of the air and the weight of warmth that the air in India has. And I was sitting at Srila Prabhupada's feet, looking along his body at him, and I just had a moment, like I guess a cathartic moment. And I didn't speak outwardly, but I spoke very clearly in my heart, and I said, Srila Prabhupada, what am I doing here? Why am I here? Who are you? And he sat up by himself, and he couldn't do that at that point. And for like 10 minutes or more, a long time, he just looked at me and he spoke without speaking. And I heard his voice inside my heart, and he told me exactly what I was doing, why I was there, who he was, and what was happening. And when he'd finished, he lay back down as if nothing had happened, and again had to be moved and rolled over. And that was the last instruction he gave me. And it was like nothing I ever saw with Srila Prabhupada and all the time I was with him. It was honestly mystical beyond measure. You know, there was no way you could describe that as a normal interaction with anybody. And it was profoundly intuitive, and he defied all material logic by sitting up and doing what he did. And he sat bolt upright, straight, and stared, and didn't stop staring while he spoke without speaking like that. And it was very clear, very basic. There was nothing kind of odd or nothing mixed up with the madness of my mind in there. It was lucid. You know, you're the eternal servant of Krishna, and Srila Prabhupada was non-different to Vrindavan. There was no point of distinction between Srila Prabhupada's mood, his motive, and what Vrindavan was. They were the same thing. Everything made sense then. Seeing Srila Prabhupada in Vrindavan was the most amazing thing. I'll spend many lifetimes coming to grips with that, I'm sure.
There was one conversation that took place with Srila Prabhupada in the fall of 1969 en route to a lecture at Conway Hall from where we resided at John Lennon's estate called Tittenhurst. I was present in the van that brought him there. Generally speaking, only the driver and Srila Prabhupada sat in the front of the van, and they were bucket seats. And then the back of the van was left empty, just the metal floor. So I was sitting with my back leaning against the back of his seat on the floor, chanting japa. We had been en route some time. It was very dark by then, and Srila Prabhupada said just loud enough for me to hear, "When I leave this body, see that it is taken around Vrindavan on a palanquin on parikrama." It was so short. It was just a sentence out of the dark and the night, and very stunning to me because I was absorbed in japa, something Srila Prabhupada had never mentioned and I had never thought of. So I rose to my knees and leaned over so my head was just even with his shoulder. And I said, "Srila Prabhupada, why are you telling me this? Better you tell this to Tamal Krishna, because he has more capacity to see that it is done than I do." And Srila Prabhupada paused briefly and then said, "No, you can tell him," and fell silent. And I too fell silent. So that this came to pass is very salient and so important, because while I did mention that to Tamal Krishna sometime after the conversation, it wasn't something that we spoke about in subsequent years, so that it happened through whatever arrangement of the devotees there means that Srila Prabhupada's wish was fulfilled, and so many Brajbasis were able to pay their respect to Srila Prabhupada in this traditional way.
Govindam Adipurisham Tamaham Bhajami Benam Kanmantang Aravinda Dalayataksam Benam Kanmantang Aravinda Dalayataksam barahavatang samasita.
As we went from one place to the other, people were performing arti, offering flowers, offering prasadam. Just, all of Vrindavan was displaying their love and affection for Srila Prabhupada. And then finally we brought him back, and then we prepared to put him in the samadhi. And the thing that amazed me is that Srila Prabhupada had left the night before, and now this was almost noon of the day after. So this has been a significant amount of time. And of course, for an ordinary man, within an hour or two, rigor mortis sets in, and the body gets stiff like a board. But Srila Prabhupada, his entire body remained not stiff at all. It was completely loose. Every joint, every part of his body was loose and completely flexible. There was no mottling, no settling of blood in the different areas of the body that happens to people, the ordinary persons who die. There was no odor. And we had undressed him again and prepared him to bring him down into the samadhi, and his body was still fragrant. Every symptom was that of a greatly advanced Mahabhagavat, completely pure, completely Brahman, completely spiritualized, who had achieved Mahasamadhi.
Kannatpakoti kamaniya visheso sobhang govindam adi purusham tamaham bhajami chintamani.
He was carried on a chair, sat under the tamal tree for darshan of the deities. And we could all tell it wouldn't be long. This one day, Prabhupada had this magnificent garland on. And for a moment I looked at him and I thought, oh, I wish I had that garland. And immediately I felt so horrible. I felt, here's your spiritual master, and look at him, and you're wanting something from him? And I started crying. I was so ashamed. I went to the corner of the courtyard and I couldn't stop crying. At that moment, Vrindavaneshwari, my daughter, was 2. She went over to Prabhupada spontaneously, paid her obeisances. And as she was getting up, Prabhupada took the garland off and placed it on her. She ran over to me and immediately put it on me. I have that garland today. I've dried it. I've sewn cloth around it. And that garland is being used when we're in the company of different individuals who are leaving their body. They wear that garland. So Prabhupada's mercy is very far-reaching.
The Samadhi ceremony was going on. Narayan Maharaj was organizing. 1 or 2 of his assistants were there. Bharadraj was leading that kirtan. I was having the kartals. Nitai Chand was playing the mridanga. And a few hundred devotees were chanting. And then, of course, after Prabhupada was placed there, salt was surrounded underneath and on all sides to form an antiseptic cover for the transcendental body of Prabhupada. And then soil was thrown in. I was also fortunate to throw some soil on top. It is said in the CC during that Samadhi ceremony of Haridas Thakur that anyone who throws soil into the Samadhi of a pure devotee will be liberated. We'll go back to Godhead. So I was thinking, even here we're getting Prabhupada's mercy. Of course, there'd been an Abhishek of Prabhupada just prior to his entering the Samadhi. And then the Abhishek water came out, and I was fortunate to get about 1 liter of it, which I drank. I kept a small quantity in some small bottles. So I was able to throw soil into the samadhi and at the same time drink the Charanamrita.
The hole which was dug for placing Prabhupada in samadhi, the devotees had stayed up all night excavating that hole. There was a little roped off area and we were all just pressed up against this rope watching. Of course we didn't know what was going on, but we watched and gradually Srila Prabhupada's transcendental Sri Vigraha became covered, and then it really started hitting me that this is the last time that I'm going to see Srila Prabhupada with my eyes. And then I just broke out weeping and weeping. And that was the completion. They poured the earth on top of the samadhi, and I remember going back to my room, sitting down in front of one of the favorite pictures I kept of Srila Prabhupada, and I just did my own little Guru Puja for Srila Prabhupada. And then after that I just collapsed, took rest, and got up a couple hours later, and there was a whole ceremony going on of different speakers coming and glorifying Srila Prabhupada, and then after that there was a huge feast, and all the residents of Vrindavan came, and thousands of people were fed with prasadam in Prabhupada's honor.
I witnessed the transference of Srila Prabhupada from his manifest to his unmanifest pastimes. I witnessed Prabhupada's final parikrama around Vrindavan. I witnessed Prabhupada's interment in his samadhi in Vrindavan. And I also witnessed the installation of the Pushpa samadhi in Mayapur. And to this day, you could tear my soul from my body, but you could not separate me from the conviction that Srila Prabhupada is completely embodied in his books, and that he's fully present in his samadhis in Mayapur and Vrindavan, and that he's present wherever his devotees are sincerely trying to carry on his mission.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama.
Considering his last will of going around Govardhan, his followers, his disciples, did take Prabhupada, the small brass murti of Srila Prabhupada, which was first taken to Radhakund and bathed with Radhakund water. And there was a procession around Govardhan Hill, hundreds and hundreds of devotees and friends and well-wishers, followers of Prabhupada. We went performing Govardhan Puja. Prabhupada was on the mind of all of us, so we were carrying Prabhupada on our minds and in our hearts, so how could Prabhupada not be there? He was very much there. Prabhupada, his mission of preaching, he wasn't thinking of stopping at any time. He was just unstoppable. His desire to spread Krishna consciousness was so intense. He was dead set. If you talk of determination, he's a personification of great determination to spread Krishna consciousness, and he exemplified that by his last will of going around Govardhan. It wasn't a drama for him. He wanted to go. He wanted to go on a bullock cart and
travel or do some preaching or programs if possible. The night before he was appealed to, please don't go, don't go. And the next day he comes up with this bus program. Take me on the bus. Take me out of here. I want to be in the field, be with the public. Let me die on the battlefield, preaching, battling with Maya. So he was trying to make his followers understand his spirit, his determination to spread Krishna consciousness. And this is how he was preparing us or his followers, future generations, to go on till they reach every town and every village in the world. Like Prabhupada, he was so determined. He would not stop till Krishna consciousness movement reaches Nagaradi Gram Sarvatra Prachar Hoi Be Mora Nam. So I think Prabhupada would be accompanying the preacher of Krishna consciousness movement who would be visiting the very last village on this planet, bringing the holy name there. The will, power that he had, strong will, which is only giving us inspiration to carry on spreading this Krishna consciousness movement.
When Prabhupada first came back in 1977, he gave a real intense lecture about Vani and Vapu, association through personal association or association through instruction. And I remember the intensity of that too, because we also had our teachers, despite the problems, they were pretty sincerely into this. I mean, why else would they give up their lives? So whenever Prabhupada would give these heavy lectures, they used to kind of go out of their way to make sure we got the point. And so I remember when Prabhupada gave that intense lecture, so many of you want to be around me physically, right? But the truth is when you associate with me through my instructions, it's much more effective and I'm much more pleased by it. Of course, we want Sangha with the sadhus and with the spiritual master, but he said the most important thing is to associate by carrying out their instructions, carrying on their mission. And I remember that too, and I knew what it meant. And then I've noticed even as an adult, a lot of projects I've done, the ones that were completely successful were when I've always had that attitude that somehow I'm with Prabhupada.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
When I first met him, I looked at him when I didn't know what to say, and I said, Srila Kinchana Krishnadas Babaji Maharaj. And then he saw that I had a tape player in my hands. And so without my having to say anything, he just closed his eyes and he started tapping his hands together and he sang his Mangalacharanam before singing Sri Krishna Chaitanya. And then he started singing Hare Krishna mantra. And it was like going into another world. He was chanting so beautifully, and it was like each syllable was just drenched in bhava and prema. And after about 20 minutes, he stopped. And then he looked at me, and he said, I would like to tell you something. And I said, what is that? And he said, I'm an old man, and I've had a lot of experience in this world. From my experience, I can honestly tell you that there has never been a greater acharya than your spiritual master. And when he said that, I became stunned, because he was the disciple of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. Then he looked up and he said, there's never been an acharya in history who has performed miracles like your spiritual master. And then he paused and he looked at me, he said, do you know why? And, I was like so stunned, I couldn't say anything. And he said, because in history, there was never a greater servant of Sri Krishna's holy name than your spiritual master. because your spiritual master had so much absolute understanding of Sri Krishna's holy name and so much absolute faith in Sri Krishna's holy name that he personally carried Sri Krishna's holy name through the length and the breadth of the world. Therefore, he is the greatest acharya who has ever existed.
Govindam Adi Purusham Tamaham Bhajami. Hare